She bought an abandoned railway car at a government auction for $500. Everyone laughed, convinced she'd wasted her money on a pile of rust. But when her rescue dog started whimpering and pawing frantically at a specific wall panel, Sophia realized this forgotten railcar was hiding a secret that would rewrite history itself. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what's the most unusual thing you've ever bought at an auction. The November wind swept across the abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, carrying with it the sharp scent of rusted metal and the distant echoes of an era when steam engines ruled the American frontier. Rows of decommissioned railway cars stretched into the gray horizon like metallic monuments to forgotten dreams, their surfaces streaked with decades of Pacific Northwest rain and bearing witness to countless journeys across a continent that had long since moved beyond the romance of rail travel. Among the scattered crowd of antique dealers, scrap metal hunters, and curiosity seekers stood Sophia Montenegro, a 36-year-old architectural salvage specialist whose reputation for transforming industrial relics into stunning design pieces had earned her clients from Seattle to San Francisco. Her weathered leather jacket and worn work boots spoke of countless hours spent crawling through abandoned factories and demolished buildings, searching for the kind of authentic character that modern manufacturing could never replicate. Sophia had built her business, Pacific Reclaim, on the principle that every discarded object carried stories worth preserving. Her warehouse in Portland's industrial district was a cathedral of rescued materials. Reclaimed Douglas fir beams from century-old mills, stained glass windows from demolished churches, brass fixtures from shuttered hotels, and ironwork from bridges that had outlived their purpose. Each piece waited patiently for its second act, for someone who could see beyond the patina of age to the craftsmanship beneath. Beside her, as always, was Bandit, a German shepherd mix whose intelligent amber eyes and distinctive white chest patch had caught her attention 3 years earlier at the Multnomah County Animal Shelter. The shelter workers had warned her that he was a difficult case, a former military working dog whose handler had been killed in Afghanistan, leaving Bandit with behavioral issues that made him unsuitable for most families. But Sophia had seen something in those watchful eyes, a combination of loyalty and loss that she understood intimately. Her own father had been a Navy veteran whose struggles with PTSD had shaped her childhood, teaching her that the most valuable things were often the most broken. Now Bandit was her constant companion and unofficial quality control specialist. He had an uncanny ability to detect structural problems that weren't visible to the human eye. Termite damage in wooden beams, gas leaks in vintage appliances, even foundation issues in buildings she was considering for salvage projects. His military training had given him senses that regular dogs didn't possess, and Sophia had learned to trust his instincts completely. When Bandit showed interest in something, it was worth investigating. The government surplus auction was being conducted by Cascade County, which was finally clearing out the Riverside Rail Yard after 15 years of legal battles over environmental cleanup and property rights. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man in his 60s named Bill Morrison, had been conducting surplus sales for nearly 3 decades and approached each lot with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen every type of junk imaginable pass through his gavel. Most of the crowd clustered around the obvious moneymakers: diesel locomotives that could be resold to tourist railways, maintenance equipment that still had functional value, and newer passenger cars that preservation societies might want for restoration projects. But Sophia found herself drawn to the forgotten corners of the yard, where the oldest equipment sat like discarded memories under tangles of blackberry vines and decades of neglect. That's when she spotted railway car number 1847, a Pullman sleeper from what her experienced eye recognized as the 1940s era, now reduced to little more than a skeleton of corroded steel and shattered dreams. The deep burgundy paint that had once gleamed with the pride of the Great Northern Railway was now a patchwork of rust stains and primer, and the elegant gold leaf lettering that had once spelled Northern Star was barely visible through layers of Pacific Northwest moisture and time. The car sat slightly askew on its trucks, one corner having settled as the rail bed beneath it slowly gave way to 40 years of abandonment. Blackberry vines had grown through the broken windows, creating an almost Gothic appearance as their thorny branches reached into the interior like grasping fingers. The brass door handles and window fixtures that had once been polished to mirror brightness were now green with verdigris, and several windows were completely missing, their frames dark and empty like hollow eyes. But beneath the obvious decay, Sophia could see hints of the magnificent machine this had once been. The proportions were perfect, long and low, with the sleek lines that had made Pullman cars the epitome of luxury travel. The undamaged windows were large and strategically positioned to offer passengers panoramic views of the American landscape as it rolled past their berths. This had been a palace on wheels, carrying travelers in comfort and style across thousands of miles of mountain passes, prairie expanses, and river valleys. Bandit had been exploring the nearby equipment, his nose working overtime to process the complex mixture of scents that decades of abandonment had layered into the metal and wood. Suddenly, he trotted back to Sophia's side, his body language shifting into what she had learned to recognize as his alert posture. His ears were forward, his tail held horizontally, and his gaze was fixed intently on the Pullman car. This wasn't the relaxed curiosity he showed toward most interesting smells. This was the focused attention he displayed when he detected something significant. Morrison's voice cut through the November air as he approached the Pullman with obvious reluctance. Lot 47, folks. Pullman sleeper car, Great Northern Railway, circa 1943. Been sitting here since the railroad went belly up in '92. Sold as is. Where is? Buyer responsible for removal within 30 days. He gestured half-heartedly at the decrepit car. Environmental assessment shows no asbestos or lead paint issues. But let's be honest. You're looking at a very expensive pile of scrap metal here. A few people in the crowd chuckled. Someone called out, "What's the starting bid, Bill?" $1. This generated more laughter. Morrison wiped his nose with the back of his hand and shrugged. "Let's try for $100 and see if anyone's feeling charitable today." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of traffic on Interstate 84 and the whistle of wind through the abandoned equipment. A heavy-set man in coveralls shook his head and muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You'd have to pay me to haul that rust bucket away. Look at it. There ain't enough good metal left to make it worth scrapping." A woman in expensive outdoor gear turned to her companion and said with obvious amusement, "Can you imagine? $100 for that eyesore? You could buy a decent used car for what it would cost to move that thing." Sophia studied the car more carefully, using the analytical skills that had made her successful in the salvage business. Yes, the exterior was heavily damaged, and yes, the restoration would be massive. But the basic structure appeared sound. The frame was intact, the roof line was straight, and the trucks looked like they could be restored to working condition. More importantly, this was a genuine piece of American transportation history, built during World War II when Pullman was producing some of their finest work. The craftsmanship of that era was legendary. These cars had been built to last for decades of constant use, constructed with materials and techniques that simply didn't exist anymore. The hardwood floors would be quarter-sawn oak or maple. The wall panels would be real wood veneer over solid substrates. The hardware would be brass or bronze, possibly even silver-plated in the more luxurious cars. Even in its current condition, this car represented thousands of dollars worth of authentic period materials that couldn't be purchased anywhere at any price. Bandit had moved closer to the car and was now standing at the base of the entry steps, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something. His behavior was becoming more pronounced, the kind of focused attention Sophia had seen when he detected gas leaks in vintage stoves or structural damage in wooden beams that wasn't visible to human inspection. "Do I hear $50? Morrison tried again, his voice carrying a note of professional desperation. "Come on, folks, this is a piece of history here. They don't make them like this anymore." "Because they figured out how to make them better," someone called out, generating another wave of laughter. Sophia felt the familiar stirring of possibility that had guided her through 15 years of successful salvage operations. There was something about this car that spoke to her beyond its obvious potential as a restoration project. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light caught the faded gold lettering, or the elegant curve of the roofline that promised interior spaces designed for comfort and beauty. Or maybe it was Bandit's obvious interest, which had never steered her wrong in the past. She had learned to trust her instincts in this business. The Victorian mansion facade that everyone said was too damaged to save had yielded enough period millwork to fund her operations for 6 months. The worthless industrial building in southeast Portland had contained Art Deco lighting fixtures that sold to a Hollywood production designer for enough money to buy her current warehouse. The abandoned grain elevator that the city wanted to demolish had been hiding structural timber that was now the centerpiece of a trendy restaurant in the Pearl District. "I'll bid $200, Sophia called out, her voice carrying clearly across the rail yard. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and she heard the familiar mixture of amusement and condescension that had followed her throughout her career. A man in a baseball cap turned to his companion and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "More money than sense, I guess." Someone else muttered, "Lady, you just bought yourself the world's most expensive pile of rust." Morrison looked genuinely surprised but pleased. "I have $200 from the lady in the brown jacket. Do I hear $250? The silence stretched out like morning fog over the Columbia River. No one else was interested in owning what they clearly saw as an exercise in financial self-destruction. Sophia could feel their certainty that she was making a terrible mistake, their assumption that she didn't understand the realities of what she was buying. She had faced this reaction countless times over the years. The contractors who laughed when she outbid them for worthless architectural elements. The building owners who couldn't believe anyone would pay money for their old junk. The city officials who thought she was crazy for wanting to salvage materials from buildings they were eager to demolish. But those same people were often the first to admire the finished products in her showroom, never connecting the gleaming restoration with the hopeless wreck they had dismissed. Going once. Morrison raised his gavel. Going twice. His eyes swept the crowd one final time. Sold for $200 to bidder number 73. As Sophia walked toward the registration table to complete her purchase, the comments followed her like autumn leaves on the wind. $200 for that rust bucket. She could have bought a decent used car. Wait till she finds out what it's going to cost to move that thing. Some people have more money than brains, I guess. The paperwork process was extensive. Transfer of ownership, environmental liability waivers, removal bond requirements. The car had to be moved within 30 days, and Cascade County required proof of insurance and a certified contractor for the transport. The clerk processing her payment, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes named Janet, looked at her with what seemed like genuine concern. "Honey, I've been working these auctions for 12 years, and I've seen that car sitting out there the whole time. The county's tried to get rid of it at least 6 times. Nobody wanted it when the railroad went bankrupt, nobody wanted it when we tried to donate it to museums, and nobody wanted it when we offered it for scrap value." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" Sophia smiled as she signed the final form. She appreciated Janet's concern, but she had been in similar situations more times than she could count. The cast-iron storefront that had become the entrance to a boutique hotel in McMinnville. The industrial crane that was now the centerpiece of a winery's tasting room. The Art Deco elevator doors that had sold to a collector in Los Angeles for more than she made in most months. "I've been in the salvage business for 15 years, she told Janet. "Sometimes the best treasures are the ones that everyone else has given up on." That evening, Sophia returned to the rail yard with bandit and professional-grade photography equipment to document her purchase. The security guard, a friendly man named Eddie who had worked the yard since before the auction company took over, let her in through the gate with a knowing smile. "You're the lady who bought the old Pullman, right?" he asked. "First person who's shown any interest in that thing in the 5 years I've been here. Most folks just walk right past it like it's invisible." The November sun was setting behind the Cascade Mountains, casting long shadows across the abandoned equipment and turning the Columbia River into a ribbon of molten copper in the distance. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and most of the other auction winners had already completed their business and departed, leaving the rail yard in peaceful solitude. The Pullman car looked even more forlorn in the fading light, but also somehow more dignified, as if the approaching darkness was softening its imperfections and revealing hints of its former grandeur. Sophia climbed the rusted steps carefully, testing each one before putting her full weight on it. The door was unlocked. Who would bother to secure an abandoned railway car? And opened with a prolonged squeal of protest from hinges that hadn't been lubricated in decades. The interior was worse than she had imagined during the daylight inspection. Years of rain through broken windows had created pools of standing water that had long since stagnated and evaporated, leaving behind mineral deposits and the kind of pervasive dampness that promoted rust and decay. The original seating had been removed decades ago, leaving only the metal mounting brackets that had once held luxury accommodations for travelers crossing the continent in style. Graffiti covered most surfaces, some of it artistic, some of it crude, all of it evidence of the countless trespassers who had found their way into the car over the years. The floor was littered with beer cans, fast food containers, and the detritus of 40 years of unauthorized occupation. But beneath the obvious damage and neglect, Sophia began to see the bones of what had once been magnificent. The ceiling retained much of its original coffered design, with decorative molding that spoke of skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. The windows, despite their cracks and missing panes, were still the large observation windows that had once framed America's wilderness for travelers lucky enough to afford Pullman accommodations. The wall panels, though damaged, showed evidence of the rich wood veneer that had made these cars famous throughout the world. Bandit had been hesitant to enter the car initially, but now he was moving through the space with obvious purpose, his nose working systematically to process the complex layers of scent that 4 decades of abandonment had embedded in every surface. He paused frequently, investigating specific areas with the kind of focused attention that Sophia had learned indicated something significant. Near what had once been the rear sleeping compartment area, Bandit's behavior changed dramatically. He began pawing at a section of wood paneling that looked subtly different from the surrounding wall. While most of the interior had been stripped, vandalized, or damaged by weather, this particular area seemed more intact, as if it had been protected somehow from the worst of the decay. Sophia followed him to investigate, running her hands along the wall where his attention was focused. The paneling here was indeed different, darker, richer, and fitted together with the kind of precision that suggested master craftsmanship. Unlike the damaged sections elsewhere in the car, this area showed signs of being carefully maintained, even recently touched. As her fingers explored the smooth wood surface, she found what felt like a slight irregularity near the bottom of the panel. It was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a small depression in the wood that could easily be mistaken for a natural imperfection in the grain. But when she pressed it experimentally, she heard the faintest mechanical click, followed by what sounded like something shifting behind the wall. Bandit's tail began wagging for the first time since they had entered the car, and he whined softly, the sound he made when he was excited about a discovery. Sophia pressed the spot again, more deliberately this time, and was rewarded with a more pronounced mechanical sound, as if hidden gears were turning after decades of stillness. The light was fading quickly outside, and Eddie would be making his final security rounds soon. Sophia didn't want to attract unwanted attention to her activities. There would be time for thorough investigation once she had arranged for the car's transport to her warehouse. But as she prepared to leave, she took careful photographs of the wall panel that had captured Bandit's interest, marking its location relative to the car's other features. Walking back to her truck through the gathering darkness, Sophia felt the familiar excitement that preceded her most significant discoveries. The same instinct that had made her bid on this rejected piece of transportation history was now telling her that she had stumbled onto something far more important than a restoration project. Behind her, railway car 1847 sat silent in the November night, keeping secrets that had waited 4 decades to be discovered. But change was coming. After years of abandonment and neglect, someone had finally arrived who possessed both the skills to look beyond surface damage and the patience to uncover whatever truth lay hidden within those carefully crafted walls. Tomorrow, Sophia would begin the complex process of arranging transport for her purchase. But tonight, as she drove through the Portland streets toward her warehouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just acquired something far more valuable than an antique railway car. Something that would prove, once again, that the most significant treasures were often the ones that everyone else was too blind or too impatient to recognize. 3 weeks later, railway car 1847 sat in the secure bay of Sophia's warehouse, its rust-streaked exterior looking oddly dignified under the industrial fluorescent lights. The transport had cost her nearly as much as the car itself, requiring a specialized heavy-haul trailer and permits from 3 different agencies. But seeing it safely on her property filled her with the satisfaction that came from rescuing another piece of history from oblivion. Bandit had been restless since the car's arrival, spending hours circling it and occasionally pawing at the exterior walls as if he could sense something the human world couldn't detect. His behavior had intensified rather than diminished with familiarity, which told Sophia that whatever had captured his attention at the rail yard was still present and waiting to be discovered. She had spent the first week carefully documenting the car's condition, photographing every detail of damage and preservation, measuring spaces, and researching the specifications of 1940s Pullman construction. What she had learned convinced her that her instincts had been correct. Beneath the obvious decay lay a masterpiece of American craftsmanship that could be restored to museum quality. But the most shocking discovery came in a file labeled Security Protocols. Inside were photographs of suspected Soviet agents, detailed surveillance reports, and lists of individuals who had been identified as potential security risks. The paranoia and secrecy that had surrounded the atomic bomb project was laid bare in page after page of investigations, interrogations, and background checks that read like something from a spy novel. As Sophia continued her exploration, she found evidence that the railway car had been used for far more than document transport. A specially designed compartment held samples of materials, metals, ceramics, and substances she couldn't identify, each carefully labeled with dates and locations. Another section contained photographic equipment that had been used to document classified facilities and experiments, including aerial photographs of sites that were never supposed to exist in any official record. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that she had stumbled onto one of the most significant historical archives ever discovered. This wasn't just documentation. It was the secret history of America's atomic program, preserved in a mobile vault that had been designed to disappear into the vast network of passenger rail service that crisscrossed the continent during World War II. One particular document stopped her cold. It was a memorandum dated August 15, 1945, one day after Japan's surrender ended World War II, discussing the disposal of sensitive materials and documentation. The memo outlined plans to decommission the mobile archives and either destroy or relocate their contents to permanent storage facilities. But according to the final entry in the file, dated September 3, 1945, the plan had been abandoned due to changing security priorities, and the car had been temporarily stored pending further instructions. Those instructions had apparently never come. The railway car had been shuffled from one rail yard to another as the government agencies that had commissioned it were reorganized, renamed, or dissolved in the post-war bureaucratic reshuffling. Eventually, it had simply been forgotten, carrying its explosive secret through decades of corporate mergers, government transitions, and bureaucratic neglect until it ended up in a surplus auction where everyone saw only a worthless piece of scrap metal. Sophia spent the rest of the day carefully photographing every document, every map, every photograph in the hidden archive. She understood that she was not just preserving historical artifacts. She was documenting evidence of one of the most closely guarded secrets in American history. The mobile office had given Manhattan Project coordinators unprecedented security and flexibility, allowing them to meet with agents, transport materials, and coordinate operations while maintaining perfect cover as ordinary rail passengers. But the archive also contained darker revelations. Documents detailing human radiation experiments, reports on the environmental impact of nuclear testing that had been suppressed for decades, and correspondence about post-war plans for nuclear weapons development that contradicted official government statements from the period. This wasn't just history. It was evidence of decisions and actions that could still have implications for living people and their families. As evening approached, Sophia faced a decision that she had never encountered in her years of salvage work. This discovery transcended the simple restoration of architectural artifacts or the preservation of industrial heritage. She was now the custodian of classified information that could rewrite textbooks, challenge official narratives, and potentially expose government secrets that had been buried for 80 years. Bandit had remained by her side throughout the day, as if he understood the magnitude of what they had uncovered. His military background had given him instincts that civilian dogs didn't possess, and Sophia wondered if some part of his training had recognized the significance of what lay hidden in the railway car's walls. That night, she sat in her office overlooking the warehouse floor where railway car 1847 stood under security lights like a metallic shrine to forgotten secrets. The weight of responsibility was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had built her reputation on bringing hidden treasures back to light, but this treasure came with complications that went far beyond restoration and resale. The documents belonged in the National Archives, where historians and researchers could study them properly. But they also belonged to the American people, who had a right to know the full truth about their government's actions during one of the most critical periods in world history. Some of the information could still be sensitive from a national security perspective, but much of it was simply history that had been classified for too long. Over the following weeks, Sophia worked with lawyers, historians, and government archivists to properly handle her discovery. The process was complex, involving multiple federal agencies and requiring security clearances that she had never imagined needing. But eventually, the archive found its way to the National Security Archive at George Washington University, where it was properly cataloged and made available to researchers. The story of the discovery made national headlines, earning Sophia recognition as the citizen who had uncovered one of the most significant historical finds of the century. Museums competed to display railway car 1847, which was eventually restored to its wartime configuration and became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibit about the Manhattan Project and the secret history of World War II. But for Sophia, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that she had trusted her instincts once again. The same intuition that had led her to see potential in discarded architectural elements had guided her to a discovery that changed how historians understood one of the most important periods in American history. Bandit, now recognized as the dog who had literally sniffed out classified government secrets, became something of a celebrity in his own right. But he seemed content to return to his regular duties as Sophia's quality control specialist, using his extraordinary senses to help her continue finding treasures that others had given up for lost. Railway car 1847 had indeed been hiding a secret that shocked everyone, not just because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. In an age of digital communication and electronic surveillance, the idea of transporting the nation's most sensitive secrets in a disguised railway car seemed both impossibly primitive and ingeniously secure. The people who had laughed at Sophia's purchase were no longer laughing. They had learned, as she had always known, that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are hidden in the places where no one thinks to look.